to Ask the Expert, Insurance for Nonprofits. My name is Erin Starkey, and I'm a staff attorney at Pro Bono Partnership of Ohio, or as our friends call us, PBPO. We're thrilled to be here today with several speakers from Great American Insurance Group. And along with Great American, we'd like to say a huge thank you to our community partners that you'll see listed here on the slide. And also a thanks to our corporate supporters. Many of the law firms and companies that you see listed here are not only the source of financial support for PBPO, but also provide our more than 900 volunteer attorneys. I'd like to take just a moment to tell you about Pro Bono Partnership of Ohio, starting with our mission. Powered by attorney volunteers, we strengthen our community by providing free business legal services and education to nonprofits. These are some numbers that we're really proud of. We have almost 900 attorney volunteers who have worked on more than 300 local nonprofits and provided more than $9 million in free legal services to nonprofits in our community. We do have criteria to become a client, and you'll see that criteria listed here and also on our website at pbpohio.org. If you're interested in becoming a client, please check out our website and keep in mind that we do try to have a generous heart with who we accept to be a client. These are the types of legal projects we handle. And if you are a client of PBPO, this is what you can expect. Quality legal services from experienced attorneys. You'll also get a staff attorney like me to oversee each and every project. In addition, whether or not you're a client, you can take advantage of our educational outreach, like the webinar you're attending today. Those are listed on our website, where we always have an updated calendar, and you can see some of our upcoming programs here. If you'd like to join our mailing list so you can find out about upcoming educational programs, or if you'd like to become a client, please visit our website at pbpohio.org. And we wouldn't be attorneys without some small print. So here's our disclaimer. Nothing about today's program creates an attorney-client relationship between you, PBPO, or Great American. We encourage you to seek legal advice on your own or call PBPO if you are a client. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the speakers for today for Ask the Expert, Insurance for Nonprofits. From Great American, we have Kevin Duke, the Divisional Senior Vice President for Underwriting, Risk Management, Sales, and Marketing. Chris Ketcham, the Divisional Senior Vice President of Executive Liability Division. Nate Natali, Divisional Assistant Vice President of Product. Phil Shirk, Divisional Vice President of Product. And Chelsea Wood, Accounts Manager, SHS Marketing. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you for the introduction and for all the work that Pro Bono Partnership of Ohio does on behalf of nonprofits. So Chelsea Wood is going to share our PowerPoint that we have to go over with you all today. Our goal of the day is to try to be as informative as possible, but also interactive. So any questions that you might have, we'll have time at the end of the presentation to make sure that any questions you might have surrounding what is an insurance need for a nonprofit, we'll be sure to take those toward the end and answer those questions. Before we get into that, though, we're going to go through what we call Insurance 101 for nonprofits. Great American Insurance also has plenty of attorneys on staff, similar to PBPO. So this is our legal disclaimer. I'll leave it up for a second. I won't read it in full, but I can say that we absolutely showed our legal disclaimer at the beginning of this presentation now. Aaron already did a great job of introducing our speakers for today. Just by way of background, the Specialty Human Services Division of Great American Insurance, which is where myself, Chelsea, Nate, and Phil Shirk all work. We serve over 16,000 nonprofit policyholders nationwide. Our goal is to protect those who improve our communities. And by doing so, we look to serve the needs of nonprofits across the country. And we're pleased today that we're able to talk to you all about what a good insurance program looks like for our nonprofit partners. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Phil Shirk and Nate Natale to talk about common liability coverages that nonprofits should consider.
Hi, this is Phil Shirk, and I'm glad to be here. And what a great afternoon to support our local nonprofits. And, it's an honor to be here. But, let's start off the presentation with a little education, but really, we'd like to talk about foundational coverages that every nonprofit organization definitely needs, and probably the first coverages that you need to address. And those three coverages are commercial general liability, abuse or molestation, as well as professional. Nonprofits have unique exposures, and you really need a carrier that specializes in providing you the coverage you need. The first coverage we want to talk about is the commercial general liability coverage. This protects the nonprofits from instances where you cause damage, either bodily injury or property damage to others, where you're legally liable. This coverage will become your best friend very quickly. And really what it's paying for, just to give you some examples, let's say you got out a little late that morning after a pretty substantial snowfall, and you have one of your clients slip and fall and is injured. Your commercial general liability will respond to that. Other things, a lot of our nonprofits, have little thrift stores, and will have products sold to others that might cause an injury, and then you'll need coverage for that. As well as, maybe some unexpected property damage. Have you ever had a volunteer out back where you share a building and maybe discard a cigarette that causes a fire? You never want that to happen, but the commercial general liability coverage part will protect you there. The other thing that I think you see this coverage part come into play is like when you rent for a special event, another premises, you'll get requests for additional insured status, and your agent, which we'll talk about how the agent really helps you through this maze of coverage a little later in the presentation, but you need to provide additional insured status, and this is the coverage part that helps you adhere to those contractual requirements. And then I'd sort of like to end this commercial general liability section with just sort of the uniqueness of when you're serving alcohol. It's one thing to have a gift basket where you're not really benefiting directly or in the business of serving alcohol and making money off of it. Sometimes your host liquor will take care of that, but if you're all of a sudden charging or serving alcohol for a charge, you really need to dive a little deeper, and you might need a liquor liability coverage part that can be added to the commercial general liability coverage. So, a good agent can help you through that situation, and you want to be on your toes when you're serving alcohol, that's for sure. And with that, let's talk about the other two coverages. And Nate Natale is going to walk you through abuse and professional.
Thanks, Phil. So yeah, I want to take a minute to talk about two additional coverages that I believe almost every nonprofit probably has a need for or has an exposure to. The first of those being abuse or molestation liability coverages. Now, when I talk about these, I just want to point out that, every policy is different. Every company has a different flavor of this. So this is more of a generalization about things you might want to be aware of or look at when you look at these type of policies. But what is abuse or molestation? It's liability coverage that's going to protect the nonprofit from incidents and allegations that the insured could potentially be legally obligated to pay as damages because of an act of abuse. So that's kind of a lot of words there. But what that means is, it comes down to what the definition of abuse is. So commonly what you see is something like this, where it's includes sexual abuse or molestation, as well as things that maybe might not readily jump to mind. Things like non-sexual abuse, assault, battery, things of that nature. So it can be very wide-ranging as far as what would fall under the abuse definition. Some other things to keep in mind, things like elder abuse, child abuse, or when you're dealing with like fragile or dependent, people, abuse of those types of individuals as well. So it can really encompass a lot of different things. So whenever we talk about this, we always like to try to give some examples to make it a little more defined as far as what this is. But some things like if you had two minor clients or say students in a school or some sort of activity, they have some sort of sexual encounter when they're supposed to be supervised. So that can always become an issue, as well as employee or volunteers having a relationship with, say, a minor that's under their supervision. And then it can also be something that's, a lot more common that we see as far as bullying these days. So, one student bullies another student or, is disrespectful to some elders. So those are all kind of examples of things that could fall under this abuse liability coverage. And like I said, I think it's something that almost every organization, nonprofit or not, probably has some degree of exposure to. So, and the final thing I'd like to say about the abuse, as you can see there on the slide, is that one thing when you're looking at abuse coverage, it's important to make sure that the defense coverage would fall outside the limits of your insurance. So, for instance, if you had $1 million limit of liability on your abuse, you want to make sure that any expenses that the insurance company incurs defending you against these, that those are paid outside of the limits. So you have your full limits available to pay for any potential damages. You don't want those limits to be eroded by any expenses that may be incurred. Next, we'll move on to professional liability coverage. Again, this is a coverage that maybe might not be apparent that you have a need for. You might think, I don't have any professionals in my organization. But as I'm about to talk about, there's a wide range of individuals that, although maybe traditionally not be considered professionals, they really do have a professional exposure. So professional liability typically pays damages because of an act, error, or omission in the rendering or the failure to render a professional service. And that's a big key to keep in mind when you're looking at these type of policies, is that you don't want coverage simply for the rendering of professional services. There's also liability or potential liability there if you fail to render professional services. So you want to make sure that both types of coverage is available to you under the policy. The next part is a little more information as far as what could be considered a professional services. So professional services include specialized education, knowledge, labor, judgment, and skill. So this would be things like when you think about a camp counselor, that might not on the face of it seem like someone that has a professional exposure, but they are offering like guidance, counseling, assistance, things like that. So that can very easily be considered a level of professional. Again, counselors, if you have anything like a psychologist, a school psychologist, things of that nature, any type of social workers or therapists, things like speech therapists or physical therapists, things like that. When you're talking about daycare, nursing, any type of healthcare. So a common example would be a school nurse. Obviously, there's a professional exposure there. Educational, our teachers, our instructors all have a degree of professional exposure there. So, this type of coverage is definitely needed. And then, any other type of services that you're providing, as a social or human service nonprofit type organization, including like religious, educational, cultural, any of those types of operations can potentially have a professional exposure. So it's something that you really need to be cognizant of and look to, cover yourself in those instances. And then the last thing, which I kind of alluded to, is that a professional doesn't necessarily need to have some sort of certification or some sort of educational degree or background in order to qualify as a professional. People that have, real life experiences that they're sharing with others and offering advice or guidance, that can be considered a professional exposure. So just keep that in mind. And when you're looking at these type of policies, those are the things you want to really hone in on and make sure that it's providing the level of coverage that your organization needs. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris, and he's going to talk a little bit about directors and officers coverage.
Thanks, Nate. Yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about D&O coverage. A lot of people may not know really what D&O coverage specifically is. It's very similar to what Nate was just talking about in terms of professional liability, but it's a specialized form of professional liability that strictly covers the nonprofit for any wrongful acts that come out of the capacity of being a director or officer of the organization and directing things that they do on a day-to-day basis while they're wearing the director and officer hat, as it were. Coverage includes defense against claims, seeking those damages. That's really important because what we found is very often the defense costs associated with claims is sometimes the biggest part of the exposure related to a D&O type claim. And it's real important that you could be fighting over a nominal amount of dollars, but the defense costs can quickly escalate and be very material. The other part of a D&O policy is it in most cases includes employment practices liability coverage as well. And that provides coverage for employment practices, wrongful acts that can be wrongful termination, age discrimination, and harassment. That can also be those kind of claims can come up in a volunteer context because sometimes nonprofits will say, hey, I don't have any employees or a minimal amount of employees. So if someone were harassing a routine volunteer, that could certainly trigger an employment practices liability type claim under the policy. As has kind of been alluded to, examples of claims include breach of bylaws by the executive director, breach of fiduciary duty to the organization, and wrongful termination to a protected class. Some of the key terms, I just think it's important because a lot of people will go, hey, not really sure how a D&O policy works. Most cases, people, you'd work with your agent to buy coverage and usually provide an application, which you would, and would get that coverage through those means. But claims can be a variety of things, even written demands or a lawsuit that's brought against members of the board of a nonprofit organization. Could also be mediations or a lot of other areas in terms of claims. So it's a fairly broad definition of claim. Losses would include the cost of defense, any settlements, judgments. More often than not, people want to try and settle claims because taking it fully through a trial is an expensive proposition, and people want to be expedient in terms of getting claims to likely go away. It also, in terms of loss subject to state language, would include compensatory and punitive or exemplary damages. So if there was some type of punitive damages awarded against a director, that would typically be covered as long as it's lawful in the state that you're providing that coverage. Insureds I just wanted to point out the organization's going to be covered in any of its subsidiary entities, and insured persons is very broad. It includes the directors and officers, as well as all employees, interns, and volunteers. So you don't need to schedule those. A lot of times people get worried that they'll say, hey, we don't have many employees, but all of your volunteers would be covered under the policy as well. Lastly, wrongful act, it really gets back to the capacity that you're working for the organization or doing providing services for the organization, and will include including a error, omission, an employed lawyer, legal services, as long as it's in the capacity for that nonprofit organization. Also, it would include, as I've mentioned before, employment practices wrongful act, as well as a third-party wrongful act. A good example of that is, hey, if a nonprofit was dealing with a third-party vendor, the example that gets used often is someone delivers packages, a FedEx person comes up and gets routinely harassed in some way, there would be coverage for the organization for some type of claim related to that. And in terms of personal injury, that's really related to the D&O capacity. So I wanted to really quickly just show you a graph that shows the number of claims that we get in different cause descriptions. And the reason I show this is D&O claims come in a variety of different ways, and even some of the largest ones on this list are related to other issues so D&O claims can come from a whole host of areas, and I think sometimes it's always a lack of imagination of not being able to see different kinds of claims that can come. What we do see the most often are employment claims, because those would just most readily happen, and those can be either sexual harassment, wrongful termination, defamation, or just general harassment in general are the largest. But we do see D&O claims related to, as I said, breach of bylaws or rules or regulatory matters. Just wanted to give it an example of an EPL claim. We had a 63-year-old officer filed suit for age discrimination, and again, repeatedly asked about his retirement plans and had positive reviews, and then he was not offered a new contract and filed a claim, and the matter settled for $265,000, which is a really large amount of damages for a lot of small nonprofits that may not have those kind of funds readily available if they did not have insurance coverage for that. And then the same insured had 6 months later, another employee brought a claim saying, hey, they had participated in a proceeding as a witness in that past age discrimination claim. And unfortunately, because they were terminated and they didn't have good documentation of reasons why they wanted to terminate that employee, it ended up having to be settled for over $80,000 with less than $7,000 cost of defense as well. So again, big exposures that can happen to people, and even if you have poor documentation, which again can often be the case when you don't have when you're talking about really small nonprofit organizations, particularly. Lastly, I wanted to just give a D&O claim example, and not just EPL. This was an example where a low-income housing advocacy group was countersued by a business owner, said that they were taking strong-arm tactics that weren't legal in their fair housing action, with conspiracy, corrupt, and coercion. And it's an example of where they've spent over $100,000 in defense costs, and it hasn't gone to trial. And I'll just point out, again, we often will hear people in terms of, hey, buying coverage, they'll say, hey, we don't do things wrong, we do things right. And again, it just needs, claim can be triggered by someone making allegations. And again, proving that they're unfounded is an expensive proposition, and can cost a lot from a cost of defense perspective. So just something to really keep in mind when you're looking at D&O exposures. With that, I'm going to hand off to Chelsea.
All right, thanks, Chris. So I just wanted to we went over some primary coverages to look out for. So I just wanted to go over some other exposures at nonprofits that you all might face and some corresponding ancillary coverages there. If my slides will, okay. So the first thing is workers' compensation insurance. So workers' compensation is always mandated at the state level. And Ohio in particular is considered a monopolistic state. And so what that means is that the insurance is provided by a state-run program rather than a private insurance company. So including in Ohio, if you have more than one employee, you want to just make sure that you have your workers' compensation insurance settled with the state. It can provide benefits such as, the medical wages if an employee becomes injured or ill while performing duties for your organization. Funeral expenses are some of the things, lost wages, disability benefits would all be considered under workers' compensation insurance. The next thing we have is auto liability and physical damage. So if you own any autos, you'll definitely want to make sure that you have your auto policy that covers both liability and physical damage. But you also want to consider hired and non-owned auto coverage. If any of your employees or volunteers drive their vehicles to run errands, to transport clients, anything on your behalf, on your organization's behalf, you'll want to make sure that you're considering your auto liability coverage there. So that auto liability coverage really helps protect you if you have a financial loss for which you're found at fault for that cause, damage or injuries to another. The next thing you'll want to make sure that you're considering is your umbrella and excess coverage. We talked about some coverages today, including abuse coverage, auto coverage, that the damages can become really, really big. The defense costs can become really, really big for some of these. So the umbrella or excess policy will help cover you for expenses that become larger than the limits of your primary policy. So you'll want to make sure that you're looking and considering an umbrella coverage if you have some of those underlying exposures. The next thing we have here is data compromise and cyber. Really applies to just about everyone these days, but if you store client information, if you process donations, take event registrations online, have really anything where you're collecting PII of clients or anyone really, then you'll want to make sure that you're considering data compromise and or cyber coverage. There are some nuances between the two. Cyber coverage is going to be a lot more broad and might cover some bigger exposures like ransomware and those types of risks. So just wanted to give a couple claims examples of some of these. So an example of a non-owned liability claim is you could have a volunteer who was running an errand on behalf of your organization in their personal auto. And maybe when they stopped, they hit a car stopped in front of them at an intersection, and the employee was cited for the accident. So a filed lawsuit named both your employee or volunteer as defendants. And so the personal limits that your volunteer have would cover them for the primary. And then if you look at purchasing a hired and non-owned liability policy, that would cover you for your defense on behalf of your organization. The next thing we have is umbrella coverage. So an insured vehicle struck a client, which resulted in extensive medical payments for the resulting injuries. Talked a little bit about how those auto claims can become really big, especially in the case of a severe injury. Also, a volunteer staff member abused multiple clients while working for the insured, and this went unreported for many years. These can also become very, very costly claims, especially the older that they get, and could easily hit your umbrella coverage. And then lastly, we have an example of cyber. So a nonprofit organization accidentally disclosed an unencrypted personal data of its donors due to an error in the programming of its online donation site. The disclosed information included names and credit card numbers of more than 500 donors. The organization was not aware of the attack until multiple clients reported fraudulent credit card purchases were made in their names. As a result of the attack and media coverage of the incident, the public was less willing to trust the organization. So this is the kind of thing that your organization could face if they collect online donations. And I am going to go ahead and hand it over to Kevin, who will talk a little bit about the valuable role that your insurance agent plays in all of this.
Thank you, Chelsea. So you might be thinking that, gosh, we've thrown quite a lot at you, a lot of different coverage terminology and things that you need to remember. And how are you going to go about doing that? Well, the good news is you should have a qualified insurance agent at your side who helps you navigate this process entirely. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that process, what a quality insurance agent should be, how to go about finding them, and then what are the first steps you should take with that person once found. So if you think to yourself about your current insurance agent, or if you're trying to find your first one and you think all I hear from them is a month or two before my insurance policy comes up for renewal, and then they send me a bill, then you're probably not getting as much consultative risk management focus out of the insurance agent that you might need. A quality insurance agent should navigate this process for you, both finding quality insurance coverage as well as focusing on your risks holistically and what you might need in order to make sure your organization is as safe and protected as possible. So an agent should be consultative, focus on holistic risk management, involved beyond the insurance acquisition, and should be a clear communicator between you and the insurance carrier, especially in the event of a claim. A quality insurance agent should be somebody who is able to communicate the carrier's position as well as your needs to the carrier. When interviewing an insurance agent, I suggest you ask direct questions to the above for their answers. And if you don't like the answers that you're hearing, that might not be the best insurance agent for you. Once you've identified your insurance agent, where do you start? We've talked about a lot of different risks that you might face as a nonprofit. There could be more, or your particular nonprofit might not have all of these risks in your organization. So in order to identify what those risks are, working with your insurance agent, you should consider all possible risks of loss to physical property, such as a building, any contents of that building, an auto loss, as Chelsea discussed a moment ago, injury to a client or injury to an employee, reputational damage, or anything along those lines. You can use a variety of different tools to not only identify those risks, but then to figure out what's your risk tolerance related to those risks. So on the screen here, you'll see essentially a heat map where you mark down each risk as what is the likelihood of it happening and what is the impact if it does happen. So something that's very likely to happen and has a very high impact on your organization would have a much higher risk than something that's rare and a low impact. And from there, working with your insurance agent, you can decide what is the best approach with the risk that we face. It could be to avoid it entirely, so you discontinue doing that program. If it's very high risk, very likely loss, and not a huge value add to your organization, that might be a great opportunity to avoid that risk entirely, discontinue the program. You can transfer risk to others. You can do that via a contract with a third party to provide services, or you can purchase insurance to transfer the financial impact of that risk. And then lastly, you can choose to retain or self-insure that risk. What you don't want to do is retain or self-insure a risk by accident. You want to make sure that you've properly identified all the risks that your organization faces, and you've made an intentional decision to either avoid those risks, transfer them to a third party or to an insurance carrier, or to retain it yourself, knowing that you might have to pay in the event of a claim or an issue. There's a cost involved with each of these, and there's a strategy to handling the risks in each of these manners. So that's where again, that consultative risk management focused insurance agent can be of huge value. When you do go about purchasing insurance, we talked a lot about our coverage here today. We also had an article come out on PBPO's network with some coverage glossary terms that I'd suggest that you can all look at. But be sure that the coverage terminology that you are purchasing it's understood, it's broad, and it covers your biggest risks, or it covers your risks as holistically as you targeted. In looking at your insurance limits, especially these last few years on building and real property, make sure that those limits are adequate to fully cover the buildings. Make sure that your limits and your umbrella limits are adequate to cover the risks that you face of a liability loss. So, for example, Chelsea mentioned an auto accident. A single automobile accident with one driver and nobody in the car is likely going to have very different financial impact than a 15-passenger van with clients being transported in that van. So make sure you understand what those risks are and what the potential loss could be when you're selecting your insurance limits, including your umbrella limits. If you have assets at risk and you have significant liability exposures, that's likely a reason to work with your insurance agent to secure higher umbrella limits, umbrella or excess. Finally, think of your insurance policy like a contract, because it is. Make sure that you've read it in full and you understand it as best as you can. If you don't understand it, work with your insurance agent to try to understand it. It's important because if there is a loss, you have responsibilities as an insured. You have responsibilities to report the incident or the claim. You have responsibilities to protect, if it's real property or whatever the case may be, to protect it from further loss. You have responsibilities to work with the insurance carrier trying to settle the claim and understand the claim. And so you need to make sure that you know what your duties are in the event of a loss. And then finally, make sure that anyone who needs a copy of the policy has it available to them. The PDF here, I mentioned what to talk about, and Chelsea, if you could pull that up, what to talk about in the when you're looking for new policy coverage with an insurance agent. The PDF is an overview of a few different questions you can ask to compare and contrast your coverage. And if it won't pull up, Chelsea, that's fine. We can just go back to the PowerPoint. I think it said in the chat that PowerPoint will be distributed to everyone following this, so you can pull up the document that way. But again, it's just kind of a helpful side-by-side to compare and contrast the different coverage options that are available for your purchase. So with that said, that was all of the prepared remarks. We had a couple of questions that came in advance that I'm going to pose to the panel. And then we've had a couple of questions that have come into the chat and the Q&A. And I want to make sure that we are giving ample time to the questions that are coming in from the Q&A, since that's what you expressed interest in. So I'll ask one or two of these that came in advance and then turn it over, and then I'll go to the Q&A section to ask the rest. So one of the questions that came in is, how do we find a good insurance agent that works with nonprofits? So I'll actually jump in on that one because that was my section. The best way to find an insurance agent that specializes in nonprofits is to talk to another nonprofit executive director or risk manager and ask who they use and what their experience has been. From there, you can and should visit their website. An insurance agent that specializes in not-for-profits usually has, under a commercial insurance section of their website, information about their nonprofit expertise. And then, like I said, conduct an interview. You want to make sure that you have a high comfort level with your insurance agent. You feel like you're going to be, your needs will be met. From the other panelists, anything to add on that?
I think that's a great suggestion is, get local referrals from your friends that are fellow nonprofits is usually a super way to find out who's in the know in your space.
Thanks, Phil.
I would agree.
Great. Next question. What are the most common reasons we see a nonprofit making an insurance claim? Chris gave a great chart from the D&O standpoint. And I think that showed wrongful termination. Anything to add on the D&O and EPLI?
I think, as always, I view D&O as something where people don't know what people are going to bring their claims against them, and the reason I showed that is it can be a whole host of things, because ultimately it's a policy that's designed to cover claims that are brought by people against you, and you sort of don't know what those are going to be until they come. And when they do, you want to have an answer to be able to address them, especially with the limited resources most nonprofits have.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Bill or Nate, any trends that you've seen on the package side?
Well, one bit of advice is when something bad happens, don't sit on it. It's not going to go away. Report it to your insurance agent. Late reporting brings even worse news. So, no one, your first reaction is to avoidance, or, that you just tighten up and you're afraid to report it, but never be afraid. That's when your policies, you pay for these policies, make these policies work for you. And, it's really protection that you got to take advantage of.
Yeah, I would add, I mean, thankfully, I think abuse and professional claims are not all that common day in and day out. But on the general liability side, I think I would, tend to say that the slip and falls are probably the most common, liability claim that we see.
Thank you, Nate and Phil. Yeah, in the insurance industry, we talk about frequency and severity. Slip, trip, falls, and minor automobile accidents are the most frequent. They happen the most often. Those are the types of claims I think that we see more frequently than anything else. Or small things like catalytic converter thefts and vandalism, things along those lines. And those are nuisance claims, and you as a nonprofit should still make sure your insurance is working on your behalf for those. But where you're really going to be thankful that you have high quality and broad insurance is in the event of something that happens far less often, such as an abuse and molestation allegation, but can be far more significantly damaging to an insured, both from a reputational standpoint and financial standpoint. The cost of defense alone, even if you're completely innocent of the allegation, the cost of defense alone can sometimes be large enough, and well into 6 figures, if not more, that it can completely disrupt your ability to provide services as a nonprofit. I'm going to ask one more, and then I'm going to move into the Q&A in the chat. How often should an organization review or update its coverages?
I'll chime in, Kevin, and say I definitely think that you should be looking at that every year, if not more often than that, just because the world does change and exposures change so much. You really should have that be part of your organization's regular cycle in terms of agenda items to look at every year, would be my recommendation.
Now, Chris, I completely agree. That does not mean you should switch insurance companies or insurance agents every year. But you should at minimum be annually reviewing your coverage and make sure that it's sufficient. The other thing I would add to that is you should review your coverage anytime there's a material change in your organization. If you add a new program, if you purchase a building, purchase a vehicle, if you discontinue a service that you were previously providing, you should review that coverage, and you should make sure you're working with your insurance agent to report that. It might result in more, or it might result in a return of premium. But it's important that your insurance carrier knows what's happening in your organization to make sure that your coverage is adequate for what you're doing. Sorry, I said that was the last one from the questions we had in advance, but I am going to ask one more. Are there times when we need extra insurance, like for special events or fundraisers? Bill or Nate, you want to jump on that one?
Well, the commercial general liability is very broad, and it'll probably protect you. But when you have a unique special event, it's always good to reach out to your agent, let them know what's going on. Chances are there'll be no charge or just an awareness. But we've seen it all. When nonprofits get into the fundraising business, you know, there are some limitations and exclusions under these policies, and you just work with your agent when you get a special event. Say you don't have the liquor coverage, well, hell, you know, you're going to end up trying to sell some liquor or some things like that. You know, make sure you get the right coverage and reach out.
Thank you on that. There was a question in the chat or in the Q&A. Does commercial liability insurance cover event insurance at another location? So since we're talking about that, I'll jump in on that one. I think Nate said it during his presentation. Every insurance policy is different, written different. So you need to make sure that you know how yours reads and work with your insurance agent on that. Unless there is a limitation on the policy that says either events are excluded or the locations at which coverage applies are limited, then there is likely to be coverage for an event that's held offsite. But again, every policy is different, and every potential event and claim that is different. So you need to really kind of review that in your individual circumstance. But generally stated, unless there's a limitation, events don't have to be held on your at your location or at the described location to be covered. So moving into the chat, and feel free to keep typing questions as you may have them. The first question, if we have volunteers providing consulting services, are they covered under D&O or professional liability coverage? Chris, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think the answer I would say is it depends on what, when you say coverage, what the wrongful act that is alleged against such a volunteer. Because if you start getting into rendering or failure to render services, that gets back to the things that Nate talked about in terms of professional liability, and that's where those type of claims come. If it's for something else, say the volunteer harassed, allegedly harassed a someone, then there could be coverage triggered under the D&O policy. So I think it really depends on what is really being alleged as a wrongful act by such volunteer.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, I know it's not a answer you want to hear, but it depends. It depends on how your policy reads. I mean, I've seen it both ways. So that's why it's probably really important for you to find a quality agent that you know, works in the nonprofit space, and they can sit down and they can review your policy with you to see, you know, if in fact you do have coverage for that, and if not, you know, what needs to be done to provide that coverage.
And I would just add that if you have volunteers on your premises day in and day out, make sure, as within Great American Insurance, we make sure that we, under who's an insured, includes volunteers, not only volunteers for commercial general liability, but also professional and abuse. So yes, that's a great question, and make, you know, your agent will help you through the coverage and make sure that your volunteers are at it.
All right, we have a couple of cyber liability questions that I'll ask, with the caveat that no one on this call is definitively a cyber expert. We have a different division that does that, but we'll do our best to monitor the questions. Sure, we know a little bit. So I'll turn to Phil and possibly Chris to answer these. So the first question is, what requirements do you see coming for nonprofits to be able to maintain cybersecurity coverage, such as 2 or multi-factor insurance?
Wow. I'll just add a few things about that. Yes, you multi-factor authentication. You know, do you have proper backups? When you go out and seek cyber coverage, your cyber underwriter will give you a questionnaire, and they'll walk you through all the requirements that are needed. And you know, you need to protect your information and data, and and another thing is that you need to have updated equipment and take the right precautions, and that is an art as far as underwriting that coverage. So be sure to work with your agent once again, and as you seek to get that coverage.
Yeah, I'll just chime in to say as well as because one of the questions was talking about what they specifically used in terms of management system, and a lot of those, every individual nonprofit may have different processes, different management systems that is going to make the answer somewhat variable. But I do think it's important. I can't say what the market is going to require, what all carriers are going to require in terms of information and requirement. But I will say, I do think it's an important coverage to really make sure you vet and discuss with your insurance agent, because it continues to develop. And even if you don't collect credit card information, there are other exposures in terms of if you release information that's PII, personal identifiable information for your customers or clients, that can certainly create some cyber liabilities. So you should really, I guess, fully vet that with your insurance agent.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So the question specifically was, we use a CRM system, Stripe and Square, for online donations and don't collect customer credit card information. Should we still consider cyber coverage? And yeah, short answer is yes, you should consider it. You should review your specific needs with your insurance agent and determine if coverage is necessary or not. It is a bit of a tumultuous market in the cyber industry right now, with, I think, on the carrier side and insured side, trying to kind of figure out and navigate costs and coverage. But it's certainly something that we feel that every nonprofit and every organization should at least review and make an intentional decision on. And as Phil said, in the underwriting process for that coverage, I imagine I certainly know but I imagine all carriers will conduct a cybersecurity review, and having things like multi-factor authentication, if it's not required, would certainly at least make you a more favorable underwriting organization. The other cyber question: what does the claim investigation process look like in the event of a security breach? If a data breach occurs because of a compromised link, will documentation that due diligence was conducted before the link was activated be required in order for a claim to be covered by the policy? And I think you're going to get sick of this response, and I apologize for it. But as Nate said earlier on another one, I think it depends. It depends on the way the coverage is written. Cyber coverage is written differently for each carrier, and I think that would depend. Phil, Nate, anything that more specifically that you'd want to add on that one?
You know, a good cyber carrier will walk you through some of that. And the other thing, that they have the technology now to run a program to review, your requirements and your security, whether it's good, bad, or indifference, and not only give you a grade, they'll give you a host of recommendations how you can improve. And that technology is just through the roof. And if you've got data, you really need to look into that.
Great. Two quick D&O questions, Chris, for you. For much smaller nonprofits, all volunteers, no paid staff, when does it make sense to consider insurance for D&O? And then related to that, if a nonprofit has only a board of directors and a virtual presence only, is D&O insurance really necessary?
The answer to both those questions is, I would say every nonprofit really should be buying D&O coverage, particularly, admittedly, when you're very small or you don't only have virtual. I would say your exposures are less, but it doesn't make them go away completely. We certainly see claims that come in for very small organizations. We frankly specialize in writing a lot of very small nonprofit organizations, and they do still see claims that can arise out of a variety of ways. And again, they won't be employment type claims are less common, but again, getting back to Kevin's comment about severity and infrequent claims, if in the unlikely situation that a claim does come in, that's when you really do need to have protection, because that could be the cost of defense associated with such a claim could be material. Again, if someone says, hey, alleges breach of fiduciary duty or bylaws, or doing something with the company directed money, that can be problematic.
And Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but the cost per year for a very, very small nonprofit, especially with limited assets, limited revenue coming in, is pretty minimal, in the hundreds of dollars potentially.
Yes, it would typically be under $1,000 for those kind of situations. And again, it only takes $100,000 claim to realize, wow, that was a smart purchase, and if you're unfortunate enough to have such a claim.
We have 1 minute left. There's a question about bonding. Are these types of insurance the same as being bonded, or is bonding irrelevant or obsolete?
Well, they had me diving into definitions on Google on that one. Bonding really is a contract between two parties, and they put a value on it, and there's a duty to perform. You see a lot of contractors say, I'm bonded, and basically they're bonding their work. If they redo your kitchen, they say they're going to do a great job, and when they don't, then you can have a specific bond on that. The insurance, the CGL, the commercial general liability, abuse, and professional is broader than that, but our duty to pay is really connected to, are you legally liable? And it's sort of like two different types of insurance. But typically, you might only need a bond to be licensed to have an event or something like that. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Thanks, Phil. I'm going to ask and then answer the last question very, very quickly, because I realize we are at time. But I wanted to thank everybody for the interaction, the questions that you asked, and for the opportunity to speak before you all today. So thank you. The last question I saw was, what aspects of insurance coverage for nonprofits is different from other business insurance? There's a lot of similarity. The commercial general liability policy would be the same. Property policy would be very similar. Automobile policy is likely the same. But when you get into the specialized coverages, the directors and officers liability insurance, potentially abuse and molestation, professional liability, educators, professional, some of the other kind of more specialized types of insurance that are geared toward nonprofits. That's where there really is a big difference between, a BOP product, a business owner's policy, or just a standard business insurance policy compared to specialized nonprofit insurance. I think that was it for the questions. Aaron, thank you so much for allowing us to speak before the group.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kevin. I wanted to mention that the article that you all prepared for us is currently posted on our website. If you'd like to take a look at it at pbpohio.org, you'll find it under the resources tab. And thank you again to all of you listening to the program, and to our panelists from Great American.